Hello, everyone. This is Shahan from the Soccernostalgia blog. I have the pleasure to interview Mr. David Sleight and Mr. Gil Matthews. Mr. David Sleight is a football fan from Glasgow. Mr. Gil Matthews is a writer and a former football journalist. This interview is separate from a podcast series. This video interview will serve as a companion piece to a written blog presentation on Liverpool's Champions Cup winning run in the 1983-84 season. Hello, David. Hello, Gil. Welcome.
Hi, Shahan.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourselves and your respective trajectory into football?
I can't pretend to have the football writing past that Gil has, but I'm a follower of Liverpool, Celtic, Saint-Etienne in France, and Borussia Mönchengladbach in Germany. So I guess that marks me out as a child of the 70s and 80s. All of those teams tremendously successful in the 70s and 80s before money came into football in the way that it has today. And I suppose only Liverpool now really competing at the top end in the way that they used to. But football's been a lifelong passion. I've got a season ticket these days at Celtic and Borussia Mönchengladbach. I used to have one at Liverpool in the 1980s. Yeah, I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in football, and I can't imagine a time would come when I wouldn't be interested in football in the future.
Thank you, David. And I do have a past in football writing, not for a long time now. I support Liverpool basically because even though my mum and dad were both Cockneys from London, my uncle settled up in Liverpool in the 60s and had family there. All my sort of cousins are Liverpudlians. When we used to go and visit family, a very small family, it was always up in Liverpool. And luckily for me, they lived in a house which is slightly nearer Anfield than it was Goodison. They're all red, especially my cousin Ian, who was at the famous St Etienne quarter-final with Super Sub Fairclough and all that. But having said that, I've only been to Anfield about sort of 9 times in my entire life. I'm a bit of an armchair fan, me and my dad, and the front room down here, 230 odd miles away in Suffolk. And that's where most of my memories are, really, apart from some bad and some really good memories of going to Liverpool, going to Anfield and going to some away games. I trained as a journalist in the early 90s after I left school. And I was very lucky that my first job was on a magazine called Match, which is one of the sort of, with Shoot and Match, one of the top football magazines in England. And I was very, very, very fortunate to get a job as junior reporter there. I was there for 3 years, so I oversaw possibly the worst period in Liverpool's recent history under Graham Souness, unfortunately, just after Kenny left in 91. It was fascinating, and I did get a chance to have some amazing experiences meeting players and things like that. But I was very, very young. I was only 20 to 23, and it sort of passed me by in a bit of a blur, really. But yeah, I've supported Liverpool, obviously, since the 70s, and it's something that sort of keeps me going. I can't quite shake it off, even though I'm a lot older now, I'm 52, and in some ways it doesn't mean quite as much as the day when we lost to Wimbledon in 1988 in the cup final, and I thought my life was completely over. So it's not quite as bad as that, but it's a unique relationship I think I have with Liverpool Football Club.
Let's go back in time into the summer of 1983. Can you paint a picture of Liverpool's status in English football at this point?
I would say they were, if not totally dominant, then certainly the dominant team in English football at the time. Clearly, Bob Paisley had just retired as manager of Liverpool. His final game was a game against Aston Villa at Anfield in May 1983. Liverpool were looking forward to welcoming Joe Fagan as the new manager starting in August 1984. But the faith amongst the Liverpool fans at the time in Anfield's boot room philosophy was such that I don't think anybody had any serious doubts that Liverpool's success would continue. Everything seemed to be in place. Crucially, they hadn't lost any key players along with Paisley at the end of the 82-83 season. So all the pieces were in place for a successful 83-84 campaign.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. It was Liverpool, the team to be feared. Everyone expected them to win most games, especially the fans had tremendous faith in the team. And I don't remember it, even when I was younger, I don't remember it being a huge deal that when Joe took over from Bob, because Bob had taken over from Shanks. You still had Ronnie Moran and Roy Evans, very important people, and people like Ruben Bennett and Tom Saunders, the staff. And yeah, not that I knew a lot about them at the time, but I don't remember it being a big deal. They won the league, hadn't they, at a bit of a canter 82, 83. I think the crucial season was the season before when they'd won it 81, 82, and we're a long way back. Won it in 83. I don't think anybody else expected them really not to win or go exceptionally close and pick up at least one trophy in 84. Yeah, they were dominant.
Yeah, I remember Bob Paisley's famous quip. It's often been repeated about the fact that he'd been at Liverpool through the good times and the bad times, and he said one year we finished second, and that was very much the way it was. There was actually one year Liverpool finished fifth in 1981, but they had the small compensation of winning the European Cup that year. Really, it was first or second, and more often than not, first pretty much every season, late 70s, early 80s.
They used to say, didn't they, first is first and second is nowhere. I've heard Alan Hansen say that down the years in interviews, and that was what's drummed into them. But I think they also took disappointments very well. They never dwelt on it, really, and they just got on with the next year and thought, well, we didn't win. We come up a bit short. That's the job to next year, is get back to the top. That's what they were all focused on, was winning.
Nevertheless, the appointment of smoking Joe Fagan, who was a manager in his 60s, was somewhat of a surprise. And there were some reports that club president John Smith and the Secretary General Peter Robinson had actually thought of looking elsewhere before Paisley insisted on Joe Fagan. At a later point, Graham Souness visited the chairman and said that the team were fully behind Joe Fagan. He was seen as a continuation of the legacy, as someone who knew the house inside and out.
Absolutely. It was the minimal upheaval option at the time. And like Gil, I don't recall any great debate at the time around whether or not Fagan should take over from Paisley. It seemed like natural and normal thing to do. And I don't recall any unquiet amongst the fans at the time. I think everybody approached the 83-84 season with great confidence and fully behind Joe Fagan. The season actually got off to a shaky start because they lost 2-0 to Manchester United in the Charity Shield in August 1983. And at the time, United were constantly sort of snapping at Liverpool's heels. Ron Atkinson was the manager there. There was a significant enmity between the two sets of fans, I suppose there is to this day. When Liverpool lost that Charity Shield game to Manchester United, I think a few people thought, hold on, that maybe there's a shift in the balance of power coming, but it didn't work out that way.
No, I agree that obviously we knew what they'd go on to do in a decade later, but they were always threatening to get really close to Liverpool. But yeah, I remember that Charity Shield. I think Robson scored a goal, or both maybe, I think. And, he's a great player. And they had some great players, but I don't think any Liverpool fan really liked Big Ron and all that sort of swagger and stuff. And, it was quite funny, really. They'd always beat us. They'd normally beat us or draw at Anfield and do well over the two games and finish about 12 points behind us at the end of the season. It's quite funny, really, I thought. I agree. I think the season was well set up. We're talking about new signings and transfers that season. But Liverpool, they didn't tend to do too much business. It was 1 or 2 in, 1 or 2 out, wasn't it, really, David, I think?
That's right. I think that summer, Michael Robinson came in from Brighton, Gary Gillespie from Coventry City, and Bob Boulder as a new reserve goalkeeper. But Liverpool's style at the time was just 1 or 2 players in or out each season. And the players who came in were normally, I think we call them today, sort of project signings in the main. There were players who perhaps weren't quite ready to go straight into the first team, but represented players with the development potential to be first team players in the fullness of time. Robinson certainly fell into that category, and Gary Gillespie played pretty much the full 83-84 season in the reserves before beginning to establish himself in the team from the mid-1980s onwards.
Their transfer policy and, their scouting, I can hardly think of a player that didn't really do well. Some people questioned David Hodgson maybe the year before and people like that, but he did all right. As a reserve striker to come in, if Rushy or Kenny were injured and stuff, he did all right. And Michael Robinson certainly got quite a few goals. But yeah, it was very minimal. It was economic in all areas, I think, their transfer policy.
Yeah, the thing at the time was the very low turnover of players during the course of a season. I mean, football was a different game then, and you sort of look down the Liverpool kind of team lines, and they used to be sort of published in the programme every week, and it was the same names week after week after week. The team never ever changed. I remember Liverpool signing Frank McGarvey from St Mirren, who went on to have a very successful career at Celtic in 1979. McGarvey never made a first-team appearance for Liverpool, and he got impatient in the end because the 2 strikers at the time, Dalglish and Johnson, were just never, ever injured. So he never got a look in, and eventually he left and moved on. But if you were signing for Liverpool and you weren't quite first-team ready, you had to be patient, that's for sure.
Let's discuss the backbone of the team. As you said, it was a team that picked itself.
Yeah, I mean, Lawrenson, Hansen, Souness, Dalglish, Rush. That was probably the backbone of the team. The three Scots with Rush and Lawrenson. Lawrenson's one of these players. To a certain extent, he was always arguably in Alan Hansen's shadow, but I thought Mark Lawrenson for 2 or 3 years in the early to mid 1980s was the best central defender in Europe. He was absolutely outstanding. Quick. If a striker was bearing down on goal, he had this knack of sort of bearing down on them from behind and just nicking the ball out from underneath their feet just as they were about to get a shot away. He was a terrific player and contributed significantly with goals as well for Liverpool. Wonderful, wonderful player. But Hansen, Souness, Dalglish, Rush alongside Lawrenson, wow, that was a backbone, that's for sure.
Yeah, anybody who remembers Liverpool from that time, you could just name the team almost automatically, give or take, unless there was a serious injury. And, the fullbacks as well, Neil and Kennedy had been there for a long time. Very reliable, and some underrated players as well. I think we all know Samuel Lee very well, but what a servant what a player he was. Fantastic passer of a ball, fantastic worker. There's lots of players down there in Liverpool's, even in my lifetime of their history, of go under the radar a little bit. And I agree, Lawrence was every bit as good as Hansen. Probably a better defender in some ways, especially like some of the last-ditch tackles and stuff. Hansen probably a little bit more better on the ball, but Lawrence could play midfield, played a lot of left back and at right back throughout those 80s, when needed to and stuff like that, when there's an injury to a fullback and stuff. And yeah, great. Yeah, I mean, with Souness in the middle, I mean, just the total governor. I mean, just he's like an imperial stormtrooper, wasn't he? He was just like, you don't mess with him at all.
A wonderful, wonderful player, Souness. I think now, looking back sort of 40 years ago, I think younger people today are familiar with Souness the pundit, but I'm sure they don't realise just what a good player he was. And he had so much time on the ball. He'd take the ball, trap it, just turn through 180 degrees and spray a pass off in the opposite direction. And of course, he could mix it a little bit when he had to as well. He could look after himself and his teammates, but a fantastic player.
I love the camaraderie from all the great Liverpool teams, whichever age group you sort of saw most of from that sort of 79, 80 season onwards for me, really. And it's the bond they seem to have and the pride in the club and the respect for the managers and the coaching staff, the trust the managers and coaching staff had in them. They seem really close-knit. The book I'm writing about being an armchair fan is focusing on all the times I remember being, watching Liverpool, especially at home and growing up and stuff. But even still under Dalglish's teams, 85, 86 and through to sort of 89, 90, they were like mates. They all felt like family to you. You know what I mean? You sort of felt you knew them really just through watching them all the time. And like I say, David, you had a season ticket at Anfield and stuff. That must have been an amazing experience to have. What years were you a season ticket holder?
I was a season ticket holder from, trying to think, 82 through round about 1990, something like that. So right through most of the 1980s. And those were the days, by the way, where you just wrote off to Liverpool in the summer, enclosing a cheque for £40 for your COP season ticket and a stamped addressed envelope, and you got one back. There was no waiting list, no queues. You just got one if you wanted one. It was a simpler life.
It was, yeah. Yeah, I remember that. I remember the occasion when we did get a chance. My dad's friends used to drive us up about 5 a.m. from Suffolk to Liverpool to go a game just on the spur of the moment. And I'd have like 10 quid in my pocket to get a standing ticket on the COP or off one of the little touts. Usually about touts that are about 11 years old, trying to sell you tickets outside the COP and stuff like that. As I say about nearly everything when I'm my age now, they were different times. They were simpler times.
Simpler times. I remember leaping forward a couple of years. I remember turning up for the 1985 European Cup semi-final at Anfield against Panathinaikos. I just took the train up from London in the afternoon, wandered along to ticket office about 6 p.m. and bought 2 main stand seats. No problem.
Unbelievable. That's great.
35,000 there that night, about 10,000 shy of capacity for a European Cup semi-final. Those were tough economic times on Merseyside, no doubt about that. And empty seats certainly you could always see them in the Kenlin Road stand on the television were a regular feature, particularly for cup games. People just couldn't afford to go. It was as simple as that.
No, you can see that very clearly, can't you? I can remember that at the time watching the games. If one was on the BBC or ITV in the evening and stuff, and years since. But yeah, sometimes you're surprised looking at them in retrospect, thinking, "Blimey, why wasn't it a full house? European quarterfinal or European semi-final, especially up in that area of the country, they just couldn't afford it."
I was looking back at the attendance figures for the 83-84 season, the campaign we're talking about. Liverpool played first round Milk Cup tie, aka League Cup tie, against Brentford at Anfield that season, and there were just under 10,000 in attendance, 9,952, something like that. I mean, that's just unimaginable today. You cannot get a ticket at Anfield for love nor money, even for the most mundane fixture. 9,500 in for a League Cup tie. It just goes to show, doesn't it?
The only tickets I stand a chance of getting are for the Legends games.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I don't mind because I can go and see John Aldridge play again or something. But that's the only chance I've got of getting any ticket at all now.
As far as the rest of the team, we have to mention the eccentric goalkeeper Bruce Grobbelaar. Scottish defender Steve Nicol was making his inroads into the first team around this time. The veteran Phil Thompson, the former captain, at this point he was injured. He was still on the books, but rarely featured. Like you mentioned, someone like Gary Gillespie or even Jim Beglin were programmed for later seasons at this point. So it was a very strong backbone of a team. In terms of Europe, Liverpool had been eliminated in the quarterfinals by Eastern European sides. The Bulgarian CSKA in 1982 and the Polish side Widzio Lodz in the previous season, 1982-83. Was there a feeling that Liverpool's European era had ended, or were Liverpool just as confident? And was even a European victory a declared objective at this point?
What do you think, Gil?
I wasn't talking to a lot of that age people in the area and stuff like that. I remember I talked to my cousin a fair bit, my cousin Ian up in Liverpool. I think that it's almost the same as when they lost the league to Villa in 81, is that you then sort of think about what would it be like if we didn't win the league the next couple of years, what would happen then if there was like a 3-year gap. Same with the European Cup, 77, 78, 81, gap of 3 years. Yeah, there were slightly surprise defeats, I think, both years in the quarters, especially we'd beaten CSK handsomely, I think, the year before and stuff. But I don't remember. I just think you had like a blind faith, especially as a young fan. You didn't think what would happen. I didn't think I'd looked ahead too much in sense of like going, what would it be like if Liverpool didn't win the European Cup for another 3 or 4 years? It was a bit like, here we go again. The season's up. Here we go. European ties in the autumn. Then you get through to the quarterfinals in the spring. I don't remember a lot of doubt. There's just a huge amount of faith. What do you reckon, David?
There was, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to travel up to Anfield with the London branch of the Liverpool Supporters Club, and honestly, there were guys booked the European Cup final in August. As soon as the venue was announced, they booked their flights and hotels. Right. There was just this absolute faith that Liverpool would get to the final, and of course, every other year they didn't. But there was a working assumption that they would get to the final, and Liverpool absolutely had Europe as a stated aim each and every season. Clearly the league's always number one, but the European Cup was very much second in terms of order of priority. And as that 83-84 campaign began, I think people were already looking forward to Rome and thinking, well, that's a target to aim for. I don't think there was any feeling that after the slip-ups against CSKA Sofia and Widzew Lodz in the previous 2 seasons that was the end of an era for Liverpool in any way, shape or form. That the guts of the side were still together, that we've talked about the backbone of the team. And I think there was a lot of confidence amongst supporters that Liverpool would make a strong challenge in Europe once again.
It was expected, wasn't it?
It was expected. It sounds almost arrogant today to say that, people booking their trip to the European Cup final, in August, but that was kind of the way that it was. And to be honest, although the European Cup at the time was limited to the champions of the individual countries, so it was a more exclusive tournament in some ways.
Yeah.
It was an easier tournament to win than it is today. You had to get through 4 rounds and you were in the final. Today, it's the Champions League is an absolute assault course with group stages and further group stages and knockout ties against some really, really strong teams. It was less of an obstacle course in those days, but there were still some really, really strong teams in there. I mean, I was always confident when Liverpool were playing almost anybody, except perhaps the Italian teams. Juventus at that time were particularly strong, that team with Platini and Boniek in it. You always feared that if they came up against an Italian team, that might possibly be the one that would be too much for them. But the working assumption was that they'd make a run at the European Cup every season and they'd probably get to the final.
Where were each of you in life as this season unfolded?
I was 16 when the 83-84 campaign began. I was 17 when it ended. In between watching football, I was studying for my A-levels. I was living in Maidstone in Kent at the time. Maidstone United, my hometown team, shout out for them through to the fifth round of the FA Cup. And I travelled up to games with the London branch of the Liverpool Supporters Club. Those were great days. I had so many friends that I beat up with in London, and we travelled up and down on the train. And I mean, some of the things that happened were just a tremendous experience going back and forth to games. So funny. Some of the stuff we got up to, nothing downright illegal, but sometimes a few slightly borderline activities. But it was so funny, and the travel to and from the games was absolutely part of the day out. And you got up to Liverpool, and you felt you were watching the best team in Europe. I mean, it was an absolute privilege to watch Liverpool in that era. It was just a fantastic experience all round. And thanks to my mum and dad, both now departed, but looking back, they let me focus on my football and focus on my studies, and I was pretty much given the money to go and watch the Reds because they knew how much it meant to me, and I'm eternally grateful to them for funding my addiction at the time.
That's a great experience. I suppose, like I say, that I'm sure the journeys up there to and from would have been just as memorable as the games as well. Fantastic stuff. I was a wee bit younger, not too much. Yeah, what was I? 12 going on 13, so a few years younger. 83 to 84, and I was at middle school, which doesn't exist anymore in England too much, the 3-school system. So I was out of primary school, and then you had 4 years at middle school before you went to upper school. So I was in my last year of middle school, pretty safe, really pretty tame. There wasn't too many exams and stuff because I hadn't reached upper school yet. And Liverpool, Liverpool was my life, really. I was just getting into music a bit more and things like that. And whether it's a coincidence or not, I'm not sure, but the Beatles are all my musical inspirations still are. And the last 20 years, I've been a guitar teacher in schools. So a lot of my life is revolved around Liverpool, whether it's the football team or whether it's the Beatles, who coincidentally were not really interested in football at all. Probably the only 4 people in Liverpool who weren't really either fervent.
It's incredible, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, they were probably
very true.
No interest in it whatsoever.
No interest in it. No, none whatsoever.
Not at all. But yeah, I say my life watching Liverpool was at home with my dad in the front room, like yourself. My dad no longer with us, but it was it just fantastic, sort of memories. My mum pottering around in the kitchen, coming in every 20 minutes, asking us what the score was. And my brother, who's a couple of years older than me, not really interested. He's always gone up and doing something in his room or on the phone with a girl he wanted to ask out or something like that. Something I wasn't interested in at that age. And yeah, I was. It was just every year was a little bit getting a little bit more into it, from like memories of 78, 79, 80, but 81, 80, and every year seemed to be it meant more and more and more, and the players meant more to me. Like even mentioning Steve Nicol, who was again, like you say, just breaking through into the team. But what unbelievable player Steve Nicol was. Fantastic. He's been long since forgiven the penalty miss, isn't he?
No, that's right. I think we'll come on to that. Yeah, but long since forgiven. In fact, he was forgiven about 10 minutes later once they won the shootout. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Sorry, plot spoiler. Sorry about that. Yeah, dearie me. Don't let them know who won the final yet. Exactly.
Let's get started with this European season. In September, for the first round, Liverpool had to meet Danish side OB Odense, which, let's be honest, was a formality for Liverpool. So the first match on September 14th was at Odense, and Liverpool won 1-0 with Kenny Dalglish scoring. The return leg was 2 weeks later on September 28th at Anfield, and Liverpool won comfortably 5-0. Michael Robinson and Dalglish each scored twice, and there was also an own goal. Obviously, the score was a foregone conclusion. However, the significant aspect of this match was that Kenny Dalglish became the record holder of goals in Europe by a British player. He broke Dennis Law's record, and he had now scored 15 goals.
Yeah, that's right. I remember he put himself within touching distance of Law's record in the first leg in Odense, and then overhauled it with the brace at Anfield. And 15 goals in European competition these days might not seem like very much, but at the time it was a heck of a lot. And of course, that was across Dalglish's career at Liverpool and Celtic. Prolific goal scorer for Celtic as well in European competition. But those were times when teams were not playing as many European games as they are today. I mean, if you qualified for Europe, you might be knocked out in the first round, as Liverpool were a couple of times. Once by Forest, once by Dynamo Tbilisi, and that was it. You only played 2 games, and see you again next year. So there wasn't the abundance of games now that there is today. So 15 goals at the time was some haul, but I think that was probably the only notable aspect of those 2 ties against Odense. Just looking at the attendance against Odense for the second leg at Anfield, just under 15,000 there that night. Again, it just goes to show it was a sign of the times.
I need to build a time machine and go back to all the games I could have watched because there was loads of tickets available. I'm too busy, really. It probably won't happen. I always assume they get through the first round a little bit nervously, but if they, especially if they did have a favourable first round draw, which normally happens, then 1-0 away, you knew there was no trouble at Anfield. I remember watching the goals on I think the ITN news, not 55-second clip of the goals or something. It was no surprise. It was a good start, a good solid start. But they were a great away team. I think that was the thing. Formidable at home, but they never feared playing good football away from home, as we'll find out in the later rounds. Never held back. Always wanted to attack.
As early as the second round, Liverpool had to face quality opposition in Spanish champions Athletic Bilbao. What was the press outlook ahead of these matches?
Yeah, that was probably about as difficult a draw as Liverpool could have got at the time. And I remember the press absolutely went to town on it because Bilbao had a man by the name of Goycochea in defence, and he was the guy the butcher of Bilbao, the so-called butcher of Bilbao. He was the guy who'd broken Maradona's leg while he was playing for Barcelona not long before. There was a great deal of media hype about how Goycochea was coming for Dalglish and this, that, and the next thing. And in the end, of course, none of that transpired. And I remember Goycochea and Dalglish shaking hands warmly at the end of the second leg and giving each other a sort of hug. So I think the 2 players had put any media speculation that they may have seen very much at the back of their minds. But it was really hyped up beforehand. And Bilbao was a quality team, really good record at home. The San Mames in Bilbao are a tough place to go. And of course, the first leg at Anfield finished goalless from memory, meaning that Liverpool had it all to do over in northern Spain.
I'm sure it was this game. I'm not confusing with the next round. Listen to it on good old Radio 2 on the BBC on the radio, and I remember being very surprised Rush had scored with a header because he wasn't known for that. But he went on to do quite well that year with headers, I think. And but yeah, tough game. But they weren't afraid. They weren't timid away from home. They weren't. And again, I think similar to the Bayern Munich semi-final 81 when it was a 0-0 draw at home, and then it was all up for grabs on the second. I didn't want to say up for grabs, but it was all to play for in the second leg. Yes, sorry about edit that one out.
Infamous piece of commentary that.
Yeah, not going to go there, obviously. And my therapist isn't available. And yeah, they weren't afraid of anyone. They would play the game, and they would lose occasionally. I don't remember them ever shutting up shop. I think they played a lot. They were very solid and played on the break against Bilbao and in the next round. But again, very economic. They weren't wasteful of chances. Was it a Kennedy cross and a Rush header?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was it. And again, once ahead, they fought hard not to concede. And they come under a lot of pressure in games. Liverpool weren't always the most perhaps individually solid defensive side, but as a unit and the cover they got from the midfield, especially Whelan doing a hell of a lot of work. I think Whelan as well as Souness and Sammy Lee, the closing down, so they didn't get behind them. I remember that in so many games.
Ronnie Whelan's a player we haven't mentioned so far on the show, but I mean, he was an absolute mainstay of the Liverpool team through the early mid-1980s and a wonderful player. I remember him making his debut midweek in a game against Stoke City and scoring. And he quickly established himself in the side, chipped in with key goals, had the happy knack of scoring in important matches, particularly cup finals. A wonderful servant to Liverpool.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. Him and Sammy Lee don't get mentioned as much as they should, plays like that.
This Bilbao side not only had Goycochea, but also had future Spain national team goalkeeper Andoni Zubizarreta and other internationals, and they were managed by future Spain manager Javier Clemente. So a quality side, and who would also win the league title that season. In fact, they would win the double that season in Spain. So they were a good side. Now, and just to recap, so on October 19th at Anfield, the match ended as a scoreless tie. The return leg was on November 2nd at San Mamés, and Ian Rush headed in the winner in the 66th minute. Liverpool were through, and they had not considered a single goal at this point. As we reached the new year and the midpoint of the season, Liverpool seemed set to win their third straight league title. Ian Rush was scoring regularly. Kenny Dalglish actually finished in the Ballon d'Or voting, just behind Michel Platini. Everything seemed to be going well for Liverpool at this point. I imagine they just looked unstoppable at this point.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Rush was scoring freely. Dalglish was second in the Ballon d'Or, the European Player of the Year award for 1983. It always rankles with me that Keegan won it twice, and somehow the Ballon d'Or judges decided that Dalglish wasn't worthy of ever winning. Quite extraordinary looking back. Anyway, never mind. That's up to France football. Yeah, at the midpoint of the season, results were sometimes patchy. I remember attending a game at home to Wolves in early January 1984. Dalglish had just picked up a very bad facial injury after a clash with Kevin Moran in a game against Manchester United on the 2nd of January, and that put him out until March. And that really did put quite a pall over the sort of second half of the season. Everybody's very worried about the extent of the injury and precisely when Dalglish would be fit for action again. So Michael Robinson was deputising and got significant game time. But I remember that game against Wolves, who was something like bottom or second bottom at the time, and Liverpool lost 1-0. Home to Wolves on a dismal January day in front of about 23,000 at Anfield. And honestly, at that point in time, I can tell you, the European Cup final, let alone winning it, seemed a long way off.
They could certainly have off days, couldn't they? Normally in unexpected games, like you say, against mid-table or lower table sides at Anfield more than not. But if I'm remembering right, but you'll be able to correct me, I've been to more games, is that Joe Fagan didn't really seem to trust Craig Johnston all the time.
That's right. Yeah,
am I remembering that bit? Or he was in and out.
I think you're right. He was in and out. He was in and out the team, and I think the fans wanted to see Johnston in the team, and Johnston had a very good rapport with the fans.
That's right. Yeah,
and Joe didn't always trust him because he was a wild card player, and I don't think he always did. I don't think he always adhered necessarily to what the instructions in the dressing room were. He just, once he was on the pitch, he kind of did his own thing, and that was a strength as well as a weakness.
Yeah, Bob seemed to trust him more than Joe, I think, didn't he?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I believe Liverpool were also eliminated in the early rounds of the FA Cup
against Brighton, who along with Leicester, and I hate to say it, Manchester United were Liverpool's three sort of bogey teams at that time. Those were the three teams that just never seemed to get good results against, or rarely. And yeah, it was a 2-0 defeat down at the Goldstone Ground in Brighton, having beaten Newcastle in the third round. That was a Friday night game live on TV. I remember that one being televised. They hammered Newcastle 4-0 that night, but then lost 2-0 at Brighton in the fourth round to exit early.
Sorry, David, that's when Keegan played, wasn't it? One of his last...
Keegan played, yeah. He played against Liverpool at Anfield. That's right, yeah, absolutely. And I think Terry McDermott was playing for Newcastle that night as well.
Right. Yeah, I remember that one on telly, yeah. But I don't remember at that point because I'd never seen Liverpool win the FA Cup. 74, I was only 3. And the first game I ever remember seeing was the 77 defeat, at Wembley to United, which was say no more. And the classic, brilliant winning goal, I don't think. And yeah. But yeah, at that point, it was like, we'll do, they win the league nearly every year. I've seen them win European Cups. League Cups obviously were going really well as well. On a hat trick for that. But I sort of thought, well, I'm never going to see him get to Wembley and win the FA Cup. That was the one disappointment that obviously eventually got rectified quite nicely. But it was, I never thought, not surprised. I never, at that point, I was thinking, no, they're never going to win that. I'll never see him win that.
Yeah, there were lots of Liverpool first team regulars through the 70s and the 80s with a full set of medals, except for the FA Cup, because they went from 1974 through to 1986 without winning it, which was quite incredible given how successful they were in every other tournament, winning the League Cup 4 years on the trot and winning the league sort of 2 years out of 3 over that period as well.
Yeah.
It was just a sort of bogey tournament for Liverpool.
Absolutely.
In this new year, Liverpool also signed John Wark from Ipswich, but obviously he would be cup tied for the European matches. In the spring quarterfinals in March, Liverpool had to face off against Portuguese giants Benfica. As fans at the time, were you aware of Benfica's squad and the players? What was the general outlook for Liverpool at this point?
You were aware to a degree. You have to remember that 40 years ago, there wasn't this sort of saturation TV coverage that we have today of all the major European leagues. So you never got to see even the most notable foreign players other than at World Cups and European Championships. And I remember famously the 1984 European Championships were not televised in the UK because none of the home nations had qualified. So hey, we'll just ignore it in that rather insular British way of doing things. So we didn't even we went a full 4-year cycle between 82 and 86, 82 World Cup and 86 World Cup without seeing any real international football at all. So you were aware of 2 or 3 names. I remember Fernando Chalana. They had a striker, Diamantino, who everybody seemed to think was good. And then there was this guy, Bento, in goal. And everybody remembered him from when Liverpool knocked out Benfica in the 70s. And a slightly eccentric character with a sort of memorable name. So it's Bento in goal. He was a good goalkeeper, was another name that you looked out for. And of course, Sven-Göran Eriksson was the Benfica manager at the time, although not the household name then that he went on to become in England. But I remember reading a piece in the programme that evening, and it was all about how Eriksson had grown up as a Liverpool fan. And of course, that's been mentioned recently because there's been talk of him managing Liverpool in the forthcoming Legends game at Anfield. But that's obviously been a lifelong passion for Sven. There was a lot of confidence about beating Benfica from memory. We'd played them before, beaten them, and I think the expectation was that Liverpool would beat them again.
Been a bit younger. It was just the name Benfica, and again, like I say, you didn't see him on TV much. There wasn't endless radio shows about these games coming up and analysing it and replaying previous games or Benfica's greatest moments in European history, like you might find on a channel now. Just really, just like the aura of the name and the fact that you didn't know much about them was exciting in a sense. You'd be like, well, Benfica and Eusebio and everything, but you're just like, well, I do remember Bento, the goalie. Frey Bento, as we
Frey Bento, yeah.
At some point in Liverpool. I'm assuming that, but I'll be amazed if they didn't call him that within about 5 seconds.
I think I heard that more than once, yeah.
Yeah, just awe of team. You know, again, European teams. We didn't play that much European football because, again, only one team qualified from each country, knockout. You know, all the way through, and so that it was just quite exotic and like new and different, and different from sort of playing Luton. No offense, Luton,
but you didn't know what you were going to get, and that was remember the shock, absolute shock when Liverpool were knocked out by Dinamo Tbilisi in 1980. In the 1980 season, 79-80, knocked out by Dinamo Tbilisi, and I mean Dinamo Tbilisi were one of the most outstanding sides to play at Anfield in that era. And I think Liverpool narrowly beat them 2-1 at Anfield and then got beat 3-0 out in Tbilisi. But I mean, everybody was blown away by how good they were, but you just had no idea. They were a completely unknown quantity, as were by and large Benfica, despite the Eusebio legend at the time.
The first leg is at Anfield on March 7th. You mentioned Kenny Dalglish's facial injury in January at Old Trafford. He did not start, and he would not have been expected to even see any action in this match had things been going smoothly. However, Liverpool had trouble scoring in this match against, I guess, a defensive Benfica side. It was Dalglish's substitution at halftime, replacing Michael Robinson, that kickstarted Liverpool. Eventually, just like the match at Bilbao, it would be a Kennedy cross from the left side and a header by Ian Rush at the far post that settled the match.
I remember it really well, Shahan. I was in the Anfield Road stand that night, and Dalglish was actually named as one of the substitutes in the programme that evening. The sort of anticipation and excitement as regards his return was the great sort of subplot to the match. But it was a frustrating evening at Anfield, and there was a tunnel immediately behind the Anfield Road end. It's disappeared now as the ground's been renovated, but for years you could always see this tunnel right behind the goal at the Anfield Road end, and I was in the seats immediately behind that tunnel, so I had a bird's eye view of Rush's header in the second half when it went in, and I just remember feeling relieved, big relief, because I thought we can't necessarily afford another 0-0 draw and then have to rely on heroics in the away tie. But when Dalglish came on that night, it lifted the entire ground. It had a transformative effect on the team.
He was always the talisman, wasn't he? I mean, in a team that had many talismans, but nothing like knowing that Dalglish was coming back from injury, if he was out for a game, or like I say, or if he was on the bench, but you didn't know what condition he was in. The idea of the board going up or getting ready, and you know that Kenny's coming on, it just, there's nothing like it for Liverpool. And with that guy, he's still behind Shankly is the greatest thing that ever happened to the club, I think. And he's looking back, he wasn't even that old really. Then was he 31?
31, 32, yeah, something like that, right?
Yeah, 32, 33. Yeah.
But yeah, it's such a talisman. And I'm sure there would be many games you can remember where it was in the balance or they weren't really getting going. Again, didn't score the goal, didn't assist, if we're going to use that horrible modern phrase, in the goal, because Kennedy did. But I'm sure if he was not in the build-up, it would have got the team going and it would have led to one of those attacks. I can't remember whether he passed the ball out wide to Alan Kennedy for the goal, but he just lifted everybody all the time. There's a special feeling when he was on the pitch, just seeing him, the ball being played up to him, and him like shield the ball and like turn and see what he was going to do, what he's going to do with it next. It's just an exciting thing watching him play. So I'm not surprised him coming on helped.
For the return leg on March 21st at Lisbon, Dalglish would start. This was a match where Liverpool just dominated, and they were also somewhat helped by one of Bento's errors in goal for Benfica, and Liverpool just ran out 4-1 winners away from home. Ronnie Whelan scored twice in the 9th and the 88th minute. Craig Johnson scored in the 33rd minute. Ian Rush in the 78th minute. And Benfica just pulled the goal back through Nene in the 74th minute. But by then, Liverpool were just running away with the match. After the match, Benfica legend Eusebio stated that Liverpool were the best team in Europe. At this point, Liverpool were fully back in form.
Yeah, Liverpool had the happy knack of finding form when it really mattered. And Gil mentioned the 81-82 campaign at the top of the show when Liverpool were nowhere at the halfway point. They're about 12th at the end of 1981. Yeah, and they won the league. They went on this terrific tear, undefeated run. I think in the second half of the campaign, they only lost one game away, and that was away to Swansea, undefeated at Anfield, and pipped Ipswich to the title on the final day with a 3-1 win at home against Tottenham. Same again in the 83-84 campaign. They hit form when it really mattered, and from memory, I don't think anyone was particularly surprised that they went to Lisbon and hammered Benfica. It wasn't expected, but it wasn't a massive shock either.
They were brilliant away side. They feared no one going away. I don't think they really thought it was any different in their attitude going away from home. But we'll try and get the first goal, silence the crowd, and go from there. But like I say, I looking at the goals again recently this week, the Johnston goal, what a cracking goal!
It was, yeah.
Out of nothing, one touch and hit it and stuff. And Whelan again, instrumental. But I think with the Liverpool side then, it wasn't just the goal scorers. Classically, they worked at every component of that side. Had to work and knew that it was the effort, attitude, and commitment that they demanded would get them a result. Like I say, mentioning Sammy Lee had done so much work in loads and loads of matches. I don't know how much to get to that work really. He didn't look like the prototype athlete in the modern day, but I wouldn't mind having a couple of him in the squad now. But yeah. No surprise. Once they got the goal up and then 2-0 with Whelan, I think it was the momentum was building, wasn't it? Once that game's out of the way, the semis, it's on, isn't it? Game on, really.
Yeah, and there was a lot of anticipation looking forward to the semi-final draw because it was Roma Dundee United and the prospect of perhaps an all-British semi-final. And Dundee United, the team at the time, were one heck of a side. They really were. There'd have been no pushovers. And this unknown quantity from Eastern Europe, Dynamo Bucharest. But certainly once they knocked out Benfica, you felt that a fourth European Cup was very definitely on.
Liverpool built up on that momentum and defeated Everton to win their fourth straight League Cup ahead of the semi-finals. For the semi-finals, as you mentioned, they faced Romanian side Dinamo Bucharest. And this was a time of renaissance for Romanian football. They had just qualified to the 1984 Euros, eliminating Italy on the way. Nevertheless, I imagine Liverpool would be looked upon as favorites against a somewhat unknown quantity.
Yeah, I think there was a degree of unease because we didn't know what we were facing. We knew that Dynamo Bucharest had knocked out Hamburg, who were the European Cup holders at the time. So clearly a strong side. In fact, they'd beaten Hamburg 3-0 in Bucharest from memory before Hamburg pulled it back in the second leg. And then I think Dynamo got a couple of late goals, but clearly a good side, a force to be reckoned with. But again, the working assumption amongst Liverpool fans was that we would have too much for them. But the way it all worked out wasn't entirely dissimilar to the two ties against Benfica. But it was Sammy Lee, of all people, all 5'6" of him, who managed to get the header again at the Anfield road end of the ground to give Liverpool a narrow first leg advantage.
This would be a couple of matches where there would be accusations of rough play from both sides. Not very memorable in that sense, but again, Liverpool were just stronger at this point.
Think about that mid-80s side, from the 70s as well. They could dig out a result as soon as Sammy Lee, Ronnie Whelan was hell of a tackler as well. He could put the foot in, and they would look after each other on the pitch. They looked after each other, and they were up for a fight as well as spraying the ball around and getting forward. They knew how to play both sides of it, I think, and they could tough it out. When it came to that at the business end of the season, their mind seemed to be straight on how to do it. There was no fear. It was go out, show them what you can do, win the ball first, get it down, and then play it. And, again, Sammy Lee, underrated, but I keep saying it. He's not my all-time favourite, Sammy Lee, but, an underrated player, and, again, popped up with some good goals.
Yeah, he had a second goal disallowed that night for a narrow offside. Otherwise, it'd been 2-0. He scored again top end in the first leg. Right. But there was a real kind of the subplot to those two games was Graham Souness, allegedly, although it seems fairly clear it happened, breaking the jaw of one of the Dynamo Bucharest players in an off-the-ball incident.
And that's now with all the cameras. It's like
exactly.
He'd been banned from the final.
Things happened off the ball that cameras didn't pick up then. There wasn't this sort of 360 coverage that there is today. So it was a time when men were men, and Souness could certainly look after himself and his teammates on the pitch, as we said earlier. But that incident meant that Liverpool got a really hostile reception when they arrived in Bucharest, and I remember the players talking about it. And I think it was Alan Kennedy who looked a little bit like Souness with the moustache and the perm. He said people were pointing at me on the team bus and going like that. And he said I was pointing to Graham Souness, saying it's not me, it's him.
That's brilliant. Oh, dear. So I told you they looked after each other. No, it's not me, it's him.
Absolutely.
Get him. Yeah.
But I think the Liverpool team could have used that to galvanise themselves, create that sort of siege mentality for the second leg, and yet again they went away from home and won. Ian Rush scored a couple over in Bucharest to secure it was a 2-1 victory from memory over there, and through to another final.
Yes.
That first, again, it was torrential rain in that second leg. I remember again there was just clips on the evening news I saw. The 1.5 minute clip on the news with bad commentary, getting all the players' names wrong. And but that first goal, one of my favourite all-time goals of Ian Rush. I think it was a corner, was headed out on the edge of the area, and Souness sort of chested it, volleyed it chest height to the left side of the box, and Rush just controlled it, and as it fell, took it around the defender, and then just the most perfect chip into the corner. It's just a beautiful goal. It summed up to me everything. It was just like automatic. There's the ball. He knew where he was going to play it. He took it down. He clipped it in the corner, and within 3 seconds, it was a goal. That's one of my favourite ever Liverpool goals. I love that.
The finisher par excellence, Ian Rush. He really
Yeah.
was. Just particularly in his first spell at Liverpool before he went to Juventus. My goodness me,
Yeah.
he was just deadly in the box. Absolutely deadly.
He got better every year, didn't he, David? Every year
Mhm.
he's just more assured.
Yeah, he had that. He just had a sort of this greyhound build. He was absolutely lightning fast over the first 5 yards, and as his career at Liverpool developed, he started scoring with his head as well. So right foot, left foot, head as well, just the complete striker. And of course, with Dalglish playing alongside him, at times it was just like a knife through butter. The pair of them in tandem, it was fantastic to watch.
To have like the Keegan and Toshak thing a generation before, or almost a generation before, and then the Dalglish rush. I mean, you know how spoilt the fans were.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The final was to be against AS Roma, who eliminated Dundee United. And the final was actually to take place at their home stadium at Rome. Now, did that knowledge make Liverpool fans a bit worried?
I think it did a little bit. I remember thinking this is going to be really, really difficult. And we were all up in arms about how unfair it was, although everyone had known since the start of the season the final was going to be in Rome, and AS Roma were the Italian representatives in the competition. So it was always on the cards. Goodness only knows why UEFA chose Rome for the final. I think there should perhaps have been a rethink once Roma qualified for the competition that year. But it is what it is, and it was what it was. And it was just typical of the Liverpool team at the time that they just said, well, okay, we're playing the game in Rome. We'll just have to get on with it. You might have heard some complaints from the fans and some concern expressed by the fans, but you never heard that from the Liverpool team or management. They just got on with it. Nobody was complaining about having to go and play what was effectively an away game as a final.
They didn't really talk about stuff like in the media. If they were griping about it, they certainly wouldn't let that be an excuse. They were very fair and honest like that, I think. I seem to remember that Roma were quite lucky to get past Dundee United in the second leg, I think.
Yeah, well,
I think that was the main worry. I remember thinking, well, if there's going to be like refereeing like that again, with all that crowd behind them in the Olympic Stadium, what's are we going to get the rub of the green sort of thing? I remember that. There was quite a nervous build-up to the game.
Dundee United beat Roma 2-0 at Tannadice, and Roma beat them 3-0 in Rome. Euphemistically described as a very strange game. The kick-off time was mid-afternoon rather than evening, so it was played in searingly hot conditions, which obviously suited the Italians more than the Dundonians. I don't want to receive a lawsuit from Dino Viola, the Roma chairman, from beyond the grave, but it seems pretty clear that some very strange things went on with the officials that evening. Let's just leave it at that.
To be honest, David, if you do end up accidentally libeling someone that has passed away, I'll do the Alan Kennedy. It was him, not me. It was him.
Nevertheless, it was a quality Roma side with the likes of Bruno Conti, the Brazilians Falcao and Cerezo, striker Pruzzo. Carlo Ancelotti, I don't think he did play in the final. I think he was injured, but he was part of that Roma side. No, he didn't play in the final. And also Francesco Graziani, another 1982 World Cup winner, managed by legendary Swedish manager Niels Lidholm. Ahead of this final, Liverpool had taken the entire squad had taken a trip to Israel to decompress under the sun. Fagan was questioned about this decision, and he just said that since August, my team has been playing 2 matches per week, so he decided to give his players like 3 days off to rest. And when it was questioned if the players drank beer or whatever, he said, well, beer can be eliminated after 2 training sessions. And he also said, as far as women, that never hurt anyone. That was Fagan's response. He took a more relaxed approach ahead of the final.
There was a 2-week gap between the final league game of the season at home to Norwich and the European Cup final on the 30th of May. And the 30th of May 1984 is a date absolutely seared in my mind for obvious reasons. So Liverpool had a 2-week gap. You've got to do something. So taking the players away for a bit of R&R between the final league game and the European Cup final didn't seem like the worst idea in the world, provided they could train adequately whilst they were away and have access to the sort of facilities needed to prepare properly for a game of that magnitude. But there was a big beer drinking culture in English football at the time, and I'm sure one or two players had the odd lager shandy during the break, but it certainly didn't harm their preparation. And if anything, I think the fact that Liverpool were more relaxed on the evening going into that game, perhaps as slight underdogs, didn't have the pressure of playing at home, didn't have the pressure of all those home fans on their back, helped them on the evening to win the game.
Yeah, I'd agree. Only Liverpool could be like probably the best team in dominating their domestic league. And in a big game, they drew themselves as underdogs, going into an environment where the backs are going to be to the wall. It's going to be difficult. We need to stick together. We need to do what we can do, and we're not going to give in. I think only Liverpool can be. They're almost favourites and underdogs at the same moment, from what I remember at the time. But there's one story I remember Alan Hansen telling on some video I must have bought, some VHS video a few years later, when he talks about that trip to Israel, and they're definitely having a few beers, and I'm sure Steve Nicol had a few bags of crisps, as was his favourite apparently. Hansen and Dalglish concocted a bit of a scam. They used to like to scam Steve Nicol quite a bit and wind him up because he was quite gullible apparently, and they felt everyone was getting a little bit nervous about the game, so they decided to play a trick on Steve Nicol and tell him that he needed to go in and see Kenny because Kenny was dying. He got an incurable disease and he was dying, and this could be his last game. So he needs to go and rally around him. And apparently he believed that and went to see him in his room, and Kenny played along with it, and then Steve Nicol came down to see Alan Hansen, and he said, how did it go? What did you say? He's dying. What did you say to him? And he said, I wonder why he was playing so badly. Because he didn't realise he had an incurable disease. He was dying. He just thought Kenny was on bad form. He had a dip in form. And one of many scams apparently they did on
I think Steve Nicol and Ian Rush in his early days as well were the part of quite a bit of dressing room humour. Yes, definitely.
Liverpool had won the league title at this point. They had won the League Cup, and they were in line for a treble. Can you discuss your individual personal memories for this final day?
I flew to Rome. I did a day trip to Rome. I flew out in the morning, flew back after the game in the evening. It was just the most fantastic experience for a 17-year-old. Absolutely fantastic. It remains probably, in many ways, the greatest day of my life. It was just an unbelievable experience. I remember we were taken on a sort of tour of Rome, visiting St. Peter's Square and all the sites, and we passed the Forum and the Colosseum. I remember somebody quipped, "Oh, it looks like Chelsea have been here before us," because obviously everything was in ruins. And it was just a great day. It was just a great day.
Was it a great stadium?
It was a bowl. I mean, it was a bowl. It was a bowl with sort of minimal creature comforts. At the time, I mean, stadiums then weren't like stadiums are today. It was very impressive. Just the sort of colour of the Roma fans with their flares and their flags occupying 4/5 of the stadium, or certainly 3/4 of the stadium. Liverpool had one end, about 10,000 Liverpool fans there. The Liverpool end wasn't quite full. Again, a sign of the economic times, and perhaps a lot of people have been in 77 and decided that 84 was a bridge too far. But just a tremendous experience. Obviously, Phil Neal put Liverpool one up early on. I remember the noise when Roberto Pruzzo equalised for Roma just before half-time was absolutely extraordinary. Just like an aircraft taking off. The whole stadium seemed to shake. Certainly when Pruzzo equalised, you thought, well, we're in trouble now.
Because they hadn't really threatened too much, I don't think, to that point. I remember Liverpool started really well, slow pace, knocking it about with Hansen and Lanchan at the back, slowing it down back to Bruce. And the freakiest of goals, I mean, Phil Neal's goal. I still remember the defender kicking it off his own key. Off the keeper's head.
It came off Tancredi's head, didn't it? And just landed nicely
back to Phil Neal, who again was doing an inverted fullback job 30 years before they invented it, and was right by the penalty spot. I was a bit shocked. You're sort of thinking, are they going to give that? I sort of somehow thought if it hit the goalie's head, which wasn't fair, somebody might put the flag up or something. It was a bit of a weird moment, wasn't it? I think.
Well, I remember the goal going in, and it was at the opposite end to the end that Liverpool fans were at, and we kind of looked at each other, and everybody said, I think Phil Neal's just scored, because of course it was complete silence at the other end of the ground. And then you saw the Liverpool players peeling away and you thought, well, he has scored. So of course we all went mad. I actually just, when I was digging out stuff for today, I kind of found my programs for the day, and out of one of the programs fell my original match ticket, which I didn't realise I still had. So I just found that about
That's
2 hours ago.
condition.
So it's in good condition. Yeah, it's in mint condition. I think it's been sitting in the centre fold of the programme for the last 30 plus years. So nice thing to find.
Roma tied the match in the 44th minute. Bruno Conti crossed from the left side, and Fruto scored a actually very nice header, very difficult header from that distance and angle. So
a looping header.
Yeah. The match would remain 1-1, would go into extra time, and score was unchanged. The match had to be decided on a penalty kick shootout. And I think this was the first ever Champions Cup final to be decided on a penalty kick shootout, which is amazing considering this was like, I think, almost 30 years that the Champions Cup had been around. The first one was in 1956. So we come to the penalty kick shootout, and as you mentioned earlier, Steve Nicol misses the first one. What was the reaction from, if you can paint a picture of the fans like yourself at the stadium after that?
When it went to penalties, I didn't feel particularly confident. We only really had one recognised penalty taker in the side, and that was Phil Neal. And I remember thinking, crikey, I wonder who's actually going to take these penalties.
Me too.
Dalglish had been subbed off, so he couldn't take one. I don't know how we're going to find 5 penalty takers here. And the players looked out on their feet at the end of 120 minutes on a warm evening at the end of May in Rome. So I wasn't confident. And then I think probably the very last person I expected to see striding towards the goal to take the first penalty kick was Steve Nicol. And of course, he blasted it over the bar. So at that point, I thought, well, this doesn't look good. The odds are clearly against us. And the Italians, it's a cliche, but the Italians just had this reputation, certainly at the time, for being super pragmatic, never missing a trick. And I thought, I can't see Roma messing this up now in front of their own fans with us effectively 1 down in a penalty shootout.
I was again watching it at home as the old armchair fan with my dad. One of my best friends from our next door neighbours, it was called Nick, who was an Ipswich fan. So obviously he didn't have an interest in it. Came out of the blue. You're just sort of thinking, right, let's get going. I'd never experienced a penalty shootout before. And before you know it, the youngest player is clips it over the bar, and suddenly you're thinking, oh, Jesus. And you know that you can't really miss another one. I remember you expect Roma to score, and they did, I think, the next 2.
No, next one.
Next one, sorry.
Yeah. Bartolomeo,
my fault.
yeah.
And I think there was the captain who just sort of stood by the ball, whacked it. He had like no run up, but I was very aware that if you miss another one, that's going to be it. And I remember Brian Moore, the ITV commentator, because ITV had the game on rather than BBC in this one on the night, and I remember Brian Moore. I think had Kevin Keegan, Annie, and St John both in the gantry with him commentating on it. And obviously superb commentator, but he's sort of saying, well, Liverpool, Bruno Conti was stepping up and Liverpool need a Grobbelaar save. And just as he put the ball down, he said, or a Conti miss. And then he blasted it over and he went, they've got a Conti miss. And I remember Grobbelaar coming out and it's like running away as if he'd saved it and slapping his hands encouragingly. And you're thinking, well, that's levels. That's back to normal now. And your hopes are immediately up. I didn't really doubt it after that point.
Yeah, I agree. As soon as Conti missed, particularly with Grobbelaar beginning his histrionics, he felt that you felt like Liverpool had a real chance, because, as you say, it was then back to 1 miss each, and Liverpool with Phil Neal having scored and in his usual reliable fashion, and Graham Souness to take the 3rd penalty.
Graham Souness' penalty was fantastic, almost like with the instep, absolutely in the top corner.
Top corner, yeah. His final kick for Liverpool.
His final kick for Liverpool, absolutely, absolutely. Yes. And I'm a bit gutted for Ian Rush that I think that his penalty that he took afterwards, or whatever order it was in, but Rush's penalty didn't count towards his goal tally, so it would have been 50 rather than 49. Or have I got that? I don't know if I got that right, David.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I think you're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Francesco Graziani also missed for the Italians. It came down to Alan Kennedy to score the winning spot kick, and Liverpool had won their fourth Champions Cup in 7 years. So
Yeah, fantastic moment. I remember being a bit surprised to see Alan Kennedy stepping up to take the fifth and final penalty. He had some pedigree in cup finals, of course, because he'd scored the winner for Liverpool in 1981 against Real Madrid at the Parc des Princes, and he'd scored in domestic cup finals as well. So he was a man for the big occasion to a certain extent. But even so, I was a little bit surprised to see dear old Barney Rubble step up to take the fifth and final spot kick. But look, as far as I'm concerned, the name of Alan Kennedy will echo down the centuries. It was just a fantastic moment when he slotted it home. I thought, crikey, we've against all the odds, we've won it in Roma's own backyard, and we were all going completely mental, as you can imagine. And I just, I thought, well, if I die now, it doesn't matter, because it can't possibly get this good ever again. It was just a terrific moment.
Especially you being there and following the club, being a season ticket holder at the time and going to all the games. Unbelievable memories. I think that if Shahan was going to go on to ask about how it ranks, that victory looking back compared with the previous ones, and obviously the modern generation, it's all Istanbul and Stevie G and everything, and that was an unbelievable day too. One of my cousins was at the game. But I think that for me growing up, because of what happened in 86, especially after 85 and Kenny taking over, 86 to me is the year that was my happiest day, that made the cup final, winning the double in 86. I think it saw 84 gets a little bit left out. They won 3 and then another one in 84 sort of thing. If you're looking back at their history, I think it deserves, like David was saying, an amazing achievement. And although the team were on top of their game, they were, again, champions of England 3 out of the last 4 years. They'd already won 3 European Cups, but winning it the way they did, the teams they beat, and winning effectively an away game final in a hostile environment, the resolve that team had was tremendous.
Mm-hmm. You think back, Liverpool won every away game that campaign. Odense in the first round, Bilbao in Lisbon against Benfica, Dinamo Bucharest in the semi-finals, and then effectively won in Rome to beat Roma.
It just consider 3 goals in this whole tournament.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I hadn't ever thought of that before, Shahan, but you're absolutely right. Just the 3 goals. Yeah.
Can you describe the pandemonium inside the stadium?
Yeah, absolute pandemonium, as you can imagine. We were in there probably a good 30 minutes after the final whistle. Obviously, the team came around with the cup, and it was great. Regrettably, there was pandemonium of a different sort on the way out the ground to the buses. Our buses were parked about 100 meters away, behind the away end, and of course, somewhat naively, what we hadn't realised was that while we were all celebrating, the Roma fans, or certainly the more militant minded amongst them, had come round to the end that we were at and were waiting for us as we came out. And my goodness me, it was an absolute gauntlet. There were concrete slabs being thrown. You just felt like you were a sort of sitting duck in a shooting gallery. Fortunately, I sort of lived to tell the tale, but it was very unfunny getting to the buses at the end of the game. But we all made it, and back to the airport, and a triumphant return to the UK in the wee small hours straight after the game. Just a wonderful day, and not spoiled by some of the stupidity afterwards. Although it might have been if I'd ended up in hospital overnight.
I wasn't aware of that at all. I don't remember any great press about that on the news. But that was the case in those days, and I think everything changed the year after. Whenever anything was reported like that, so if there's a little bit of trouble on the way out, it was just like, oh, there's a few scuffles on the way out, but it wouldn't have been reported in anything like the same way it was from the year onwards.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, I think it's an underrated achievement. I think that people will sort of go, 77, 78, 81, and 84, and obviously I think 77 was the breakthrough, but a tremendous achievement, and a team that was 5 players different from 81, at least 5 or 6 maybe,
probably more. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And,
So
and Phil
really
Neal,
hard
Phil Neal,
to.
the one of the unsung heroes and the great survivor from the '77 side, still
Yeah.
there in '84, and one of only two men, and I think this still holds true, one of only two players to score twice on separate occasions for a British side in a European or Champions League final. The other being Tommy Gemmell of Celtic. I think they're the only two to have done it.
Yeah. Again, just the most amazing servant to the club.
Do you think this was the zenith of the great Liverpool side of the 70s, 80s eras?
It's hard to say. I've always held the 78, 79 Liverpool team as in some ways the absolute gold standard. That was the team that only conceded 4 goals at Anfield during the entire league campaign, lost just a handful of away games, and won the league very convincingly against a really strong Nottingham Forest side that year. So that 78, 79 Liverpool team, in my mind's eye, stands out as perhaps the outstanding team of the late 70s and early 80s, despite the fact they only won one competition that year, and that was the league. But it was just for me, that was really perhaps the complete team, and in terms of consistency and just winning games week after week after week, they were second to none. But the '84 team, as Gil said, I think it remains an underrated triumph. 3 trophies out of 4 that year wasn't half bad. To win the European Cup that year the way they did, effectively winning the tournament on the road, was something very, very special indeed.
Yeah, I think I'd agree about the 78, 79 team with McDermott and Case still in the midfield as soon as dominant. And Johnston, again, David Johnson, and not Craig Johnson, but David Johnson, fantastic player for a few years for Liverpool, with Kenny up front and Fairclough occasionally. And it just, the team rarely changed. Clement still in goal. And yeah, I think that's probably the best team of that whole sort of 10, 15-year era up to the late 80s. And I have a special fondness for the Kenny Dalglish sides, who were just, in some ways, just mesmerising to watch. But I think it's an underrated achievement. I think the team was slightly more functional. They're a little bit more clinical. They're quite as exciting, but clinical goals. I mean, people talk about passing the ball into the net, the passing game, as if it, these days, without going into too much detail comparison. But Liverpool knew how to pass the ball better than anyone, and they would control the ball, control the game, pass the ball around when they want, and were very clinical in front of goal. And like you say, when it got down to the business end of the game or the business end of the season, they've been doing it for so long that the management knew how to prepare the team and knew how to set them up mentally and psychologically to let them express themselves. And I don't think the most exciting team, but again, yeah, like David says, a fantastic achievement. It doesn't get mentioned as one of the trebles, really. And I know they didn't win the FA Cup. Just incredible achievement.
It was a privilege to see as much of it as I did firsthand and in person. It's actually only with the passage of time I realised how privileged I was as a 16 and 17-year-old to be watching pretty much every other week, as I was then, probably the greatest side in Europe. It was a wonderful footballing education, and Liverpool's philosophy was simple. It was pass and move, pass and move, pass and move, but they were mentally so strong, and they demonstrated that time and time again with these victories on the road.
Well, Graham Souness left afterwards to join Italian side Sampdoria to end an era at Liverpool for himself. Now, in closing, do you think there is a lot of nostalgia from Liverpool fans in general about this 1984 win as a reference point since Heysel occurred the following year? And that kind of changed everything.
I was at Heysel as well the following year, and obviously very different feelings and reflections looking back on that occasion. And clearly, after Heysel, Liverpool went into a period of European exile, and it did cross my mind more than once during the course of the 1990s, with Liverpool toiling domestically, that they might never win the European Cup again. And it wasn't until Istanbul that all changed. I think certainly for Liverpool supporters of my generation and Gil's generation, there's a strong degree of nostalgia looking back to those teams of the 70s and early 80s. And that 1983-84 campaign did mark the end of an era of sorts, because it ended with the departure of Graham Souness to Sampdoria. And whilst he was replaced, it took a bit of doing. And in the end, it was a sort of combination of Jan Molby and Steve McMahon between them, who effectively did what Graham Souness on his own was doing. He was a very, very hard act to follow.
I don't think what happened at Heysel, and I can't begin to imagine what your thoughts on that day are. We're not going to dwell on that today, but I don't think it takes away from it. For one reason, it happened before. It's not, I don't think it was overshadowed. I think it's underrated in when you talk about Liverpool's triumphs. I think that when Heysel happened, it was just complete shock. It was just complete horror. It was horrific, and I watched it from a very, very, very safe and young, immature distance in England, and it was so awful. I didn't really think what was going to go on or whether we'd win it again. And, even Dalglish getting appointed, which obviously was predetermined before Heysel, it was interesting, but it was just, the clock sort of stopped at that point on a lot of things for a long while. It took a long while in retrospect for things to get back to think of anything as normal or what we might do. You're just thinking, well, are they going to play football? Are Liverpool just going to get thrown out of every competition now? Are they ever going to play again? Is what I remember thinking that summer. I was up in Liverpool that summer, and there was a definite atmosphere in the city. I was with my family quite a lot that summer. I had a couple of family weddings that summer, and you don't talk to football. You couldn't talk. Before when I went up there, you talked about hardly anything else but football. And then that summer, you couldn't talk about it. No one wanted to mention it. It was just complete shame. Yeah, 84 stands alone for me is a tremendous achievement. I don't think it gets a great lot of nostalgic sort of chatter about it. But I think when you think of Bruce's wobbly legs, Graham Souness' last game, winning on penalties against Roma in their own backyard, there's not a lot of better Liverpool victories than that.
Agreed.
With that, I would like to thank both of you for this interview. And I would urge everyone to please read the main blog article as well. The link is included on the video upload description, along with our respective contact informations. Thank you once again, and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Thanks, Shahan. Thanks, Gil.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, David. Nice to see you.
Take care.
Thanks.
Cheers, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.